Hi everyone, we will start shortly. We're just gonna give a couple of minutes for people to join the session. But in the meantime, feel free to say hi in the chat and introduce yourselves just to see who is here in the session. And yeah, just to set the tone, I will play a video as well while we wait for the rest to join. Just beware of any changes, sudden changes of the volume, just in case. Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Friends and esteemed colleagues, hello and welcome to this Sustainable Screen webinar on getting to grips with your environmental performance and progress. I'm sorry I can't be there live and direct for this today. This is the third of 3 public webinars this year that we will be releasing. There is one further webinar in late February, specifically for National Lottery awardees, to support them in doing their carbon footprinting and using the reporting tools. Further details will come from the fund team shortly for those who should be participating in that. This webinar is being recorded. Please do watch it back and share it as well, and also watch back the previous 2 webinars on other introductory environmental issues for you. This Sustainable Screen Programme is supported by BFI National Lottery Funds, and I'm going to be back later in this session to tell you about what the BFI has been doing as an organisation, as a cultural charity, as well as hearing from some other fantastic case studies that the Julie's Bicycle team have prepared. Thanks to Amy and Richard for delivering this session, and I'll hand over to you and see you all later on.
Oh, hello everyone, and thank you to Keir. Sadly, he won't be joining us today, but he has been throughout this series of webinars. Just for you, those of you who have joined in the last couple of minutes, feel free to say hi in the chat as well, and who you are, and just introduce yourselves in the meantime. So some of you may know me already from other webinars that we've done with the BFI, but for those who don't know me, I'm Ami Hanko. I'm part of the Julie's Bicycle team who will be delivering today's session. And my pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black mixed race woman. And today I'm wearing a orange, red, I don't know if you can see, yeah, sort of top, and rocking my curls. And I'm also here with my colleagues, Richard and Danielle, who I let them introduce themselves later on. So if you're maybe familiar or not with the Sustainable Screen program, but as Richard already alluded to, we've partnered with the BFI to deliver this program, and it aims to kind of lay a solid foundation for better environmental practice and a greener screen sector in the long term. And our colleagues from Albert provide support within the program as well on the filmmaking, production, and development strand, whilst we as Julie's Bicycle, we are delivering the Beyond Production program, which focuses on the wider screen sector activity, which all of you are a part of, and it's a very broad and diverse kind of group. So yes, please go to our website if you want to find out more information about the kind of support that we offer throughout the program. And as Kira mentioned in the video, today is the last session of the series of webinars. So maybe you've already attended the ones that we did in September and December, or you've watched the recordings. But if not, here are the links. So definitely take the time to go through them when you want, and hopefully you'll find them also useful. And just to kind of walk through what we'll see in today's session. So we have quite a lot of different things to cover, but we have about an hour and a half to go through different aspects related to understanding your environmental impact and performance. So what we've kind of titled as Getting to Grips with Environmental Performance and Progress. So I'll just give a brief introduction as what we mean with that in terms of building your understanding. And then I'll pass it on to my colleague Richard, who will dive in a bit more into carbon footprinting and some key considerations when doing that process. Then we'll have a 5-minute break just to rest our eyes from the screen time. And on the second part, we'll go through other things that are beyond carbon that are important to consider when it comes to our performance and progress, as well as Danielle is going to walk us through a bit of, or explain what our creative climate tools are and how they can also be helpful for this process. And we might not have time, but we've also included some examples of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and wider support, as this also is part of building your understanding. And we'll make sure to leave some time for Q&As as well, but definitely feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the someone is raising a hand. So yes, just as a housekeeping, there's a chat function, so feel free to just drop in any comments or share anything that you want as we go along the session. And then there's a Q&A kind of function where you can address any questions that you have, as I said, throughout the session, and we'll do our best to kind of respond to them. If you need to, there's an option to activate the captioning as well. And just to say that this session is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available after this session. And also, once the session is finalized, it should pop up in your screen survey just to get some of your feedback. So if you could spare just a couple of minutes, that would be really helpful. And if you require any tech support throughout the session, then Danielle is also helping out in the back end. So do reach out to her in the chat if you need to. So getting into into the session of today and why we're here. So as I said, as a brief introduction to what we'll see today, with getting to grips with environmental performance and progress, what we mean is to build understanding of our environmental practices, performance, and impacts, and having a sense of where to look for this information and capturing as well what we're doing through reporting and other kinds of communications. And in the previous webinars, we looked into the process of and the steps to defining your commitments and developing your policies and action plans. And part of this process as well is understanding. So we talked about identifying what matters to you, where are you now with your current practices and performance, and what is possible for you going forward. So this also requires of collating different bits of information, data, and insights, which can be a powerful tool also to help you understand what are your impacts are, where the opportunities are for reducing those impacts, to identify those priorities and what to focus on, to set those SMARTY targets that Richard introduced us to track that progress to see if you're really keeping on track with those objectives and commitments that you've kind of defined. And also as a way to communicate and engage with your teams, with your audiences and other stakeholders, and share the story of what you're doing and how you're bringing that positive change with your activity. So there are different aspects as to this process of building your understanding that we'll look into a bit more detail in some of them, but broadly speaking, whether you are already doing things in your organization and activities, or whether you're just starting to think of what you could do, we would always recommend to start with understanding where you are now. So who you are and what you do, when and where, how, with whom, like who are the people who are coming to the screenings or participating or activities. So have that initial picture and start to think or reflect about the impact areas that are relevant to you or that you feel that are likely to have a big environmental impact, and the things, and also, understanding the things that you're already doing in those areas. Um, and then move into identifying, what environmental data and information you already have. And we'll see, or we'll look into what kind of information could be relevant, for example, for your carbon footprint later on. But that could be, your energy and water bills, your waste invoices. Do you happen to have any information on your business travel or maybe your audience travel? Um, do you have access to what your suppliers are doing, or do they have any policies that, give you a sense of what they do as well? Just to kind of build up an understanding of what information and data you already have that could kind of paint that picture of your performance. And then think about gaining like a wider perspective and a broader sense of the possibilities and priorities. So this is basically finding out what people think and what others are doing, which can also inform and help you build that understanding. So that could be from, as I said, engaging with your staff, engaging with your audiences and understanding what's important to them, to finding out and collating those insights from the industry, or any knowledge sharing that happens in these different networks or any collaborations, finding out what your neighbors are doing or your community, whatever you are in the country as well. So all of that is just kind of build, different sources of information that you could use, but then we don't want that to just sit there without doing anything about it. So it's making use of that data and information, and with the things that I already said. So how can that be used to inform our priorities? How can that be used to inform our strategy or our action plan, or to see if we're actually on track now, as I mentioned? And mostly also how we use that information to stay accountable for ourselves and also our stakeholders when it comes to our commitments. So, the things that we say we're going to do, it doesn't become something vague and kind of empty. But that said, I'll pass it on to Richard so he can dive in a bit more into the carbon footprint and some of the considerations for that.
Thank you, Amy, and hi everyone. Good to be speaking with you today. I'm Richard Phillips, and I'm a climate change specialist at Julius Bicycle. I'm normally focused on the music sector, working with festivals and labels, but there's a lot of crossover within the creative industries and within the film sector. My pronouns are he, him, and for anyone with a visual impairment, I'm wearing a blue top, and there's literally nothing of interest behind me at all. It's just a white wall. I'll be going through carbon footprinting in this next section, which is probably the thing that springs to mind when you think about understanding your environmental impacts. We're very focused on carbon footprints when we're thinking about that, and with good reason, although as we'll learn later on through the session, it's not the only thing to understand with your environmental strategy, but it's a good place to start, and there's lots to get to grips with carbon footprinting. So I'm just going to start with a poll, and hopefully you can all access this poll, and it's to understand which areas of environmental impact you might have measured previously. So I'll just let that pop up onto the screen, and it's a multiple choice poll in which you can select multiple different options. So there's different impact areas there, just as you're reading it. There's energy, water, waste, business travel, staff commuting, audience travel, or any other impacts as well. And if you do select that other option, do write in the chat what environmental impacts you have managed to measure or attempted to measure. So just give that another few seconds.
I'm just realizing, Richard, that we didn't include an option of, well, I haven't measured any of the below environmental impact, so obviously,
That's a good point. That's a good point. So if you haven't measured any environmental impacts, then just leave it blank. So I can see as well that roughly, well, 2/3 have responded. So I'll assume that maybe the remaining third of you who are attending this webinar haven't managed to measure anything yet. And actually, there's a great deal of split across each of these impact areas. Energy and business travel. I'm just going to end that poll there. Energy and business travel are the areas that seem to have had the most focus. It might be that you've seen the most success in being able to get data, which would make sense because they're areas in which you can directly access that information, you can directly control it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, areas like audience travel, not many of you have measured, just over a quarter. And we'll come back to some of the reasons why audience travel is important, but also difficult to measure. And there is a few that have put other. So actually, you may have put other if you've not managed to record any environmental data. But if there are other categories which weren't included in this list that you've attempted and maybe successfully measured, then do put that into the chat. So that's really interesting. We're going to explore a couple of those areas a little bit later. There's another quick poll that we just want to put up as well. So once you've recorded that information, the next step normally is to share that information. So have you published your carbon footprint or any environmental data? Simple yes or no question there will suffice. So publishing, that might be putting on social media, it might be putting into a sustainability report, it might be sharing internally with colleagues. So it's just about the communication of getting that environmental data. So I can already see, I'm going to end it there because that was quite a quick response there. The majority of you have said no, that you haven't published your carbon footprint or any environmental data before. So I imagine a lot of you might be coming to this session, obviously hoping to learn more and gain that confidence in the data that you are collecting to be able to publish it and make sure that you feel like you know what your environmental impacts are and that you can explain that with stakeholders. Just under a quarter have published either a carbon footprint or some environmental data before. I'd be really interested to know where you shared that, whether that was on your website or whether that was on social media or in newsletters or anything like that. So if you did click yes for this question, if you could send a link through to the chat, that would be really interesting. I mean, the particular area that we were looking at within this webinar was some case study examples of people in the film and screen industry who have published their carbon footprints or environmental data, and it's quite difficult to find online. So it'd be really interesting for those that have shared it to drop a link in so we can take a look and we'll get inspired by that. So thanks for responding to those polls. I'm going to go through now the reasons for collecting data on carbon. So often, we talk about carbon footprinting, and it feels like it's a big deal and it's an important step. But often we don't just take a step back to think about the reasons why we're actually doing it. So really, measuring your carbon footprint, in some sense, is about meeting growing expectations from a number of different areas. So globally, there's increasing pressure for climate action. It may often feel like slow progress, but the direction for environmental action is clear. We do have a global effort towards net zero, which is requiring society and all parts of society, all sectors, to make their emissions reductions and to prove those emissions reductions as well. So that takes the form of big conferences, things like COP28. And again, I stress, we're all kind of wanting faster and deeper action, but those things do exist. And there's also increasing legislation that's coming out of events and conferences like this that has maybe in the past focused on large businesses and large organizations, but the pressure is increasingly coming on SMEs as well. I imagine a lot of you dialing in today are small and medium enterprises. So the regulatory direction is clear that there's going to be more pressure for SMEs to do carbon footprinting. There's also pressure from the industry as well. So I think someone's just dropped into the chat there about BAFTA and Albert, and we'll respond to that question later on. But that's a really good one to raise, that there already are industry initiatives for carbon footprinting, such as BAFTA or Albert. And there are other initiatives that are happening as well, which all require action and require you to demonstrate the impact that you're having and the reduced impacts that you're having over time. So things like the Creative Industries Charter, which has the mantra of collecting imagination and economic influence and leadership to reduce environmental impacts. And there are targets for the sector associated with that. And of course, you can't prove that you're meeting those targets without conducting a carbon footprint year on year. There's also the equity for a new Green Deal. So equity, of course, is the entertainment trade union made up of 47,000 performers and creative practitioners. And the new Green Deal is a network of equity members fighting for climate justice in the industry and beyond. And again, all of this action within the industry comes paired with measurement, because otherwise you can't understand your progress. And then finally, there's expectations from the people that maybe matter most to your organization, so employees and customers. The Indigo Act Green Report of 2023, I mean, there are plenty of reports out there which demonstrate the importance to employees and customers of demonstrating your environmental impacts, but this is one of the latest ones from Indigo. It's that 80% of cultural audiences are worried about the climate crisis, and they want to see cultural organizations show their commitment to reducing their impacts. And it's not enough just to set a target. You need to set the target and then measure your performance against it year on year. And that's where carbon footprinting comes in. So on the next slide, that more or less follows the same theme, really, that completing a carbon footprint is about meeting those expectations, but it's also about gaining all the benefits from doing so for your organization. So you can set strategic objectives based on your understanding of your current environmental performance and where you're going to on your journey towards your targets. There's also ensuring accountability. So that's, again, the same point, really, not just putting a target out there and saying we're doing our bit, but setting the target and then demonstrating your actions are actually making progress towards those targets. And then finally, conducting a carbon footprint can help you find efficiencies within your organization, and it can create new innovations and new opportunities, which may be unexpected, really, but it's another tool in which you can use to evolve your organization, evolve your business, and look for new opportunities, whatever they may be, which are compatible with a low carbon, sustainable future, as well as creating new revenue streams. And a carbon footprint is a really great way of using that as a tool to understand where those opportunities lie within your organization. So there's some of the benefits of why it's a good idea to do a carbon footprint, but what actually is a carbon footprint? I just thought it might be helpful here to have a really simple definition so we're all on the same page. Well, a carbon footprint is a measure of the climate change impact that your organization is having over a set period of time. It can also include the carbon impact of an event or of a particular product, but in general terms, we're talking about your organization here, the impacts that your organization is having, normally on a year-to-year basis. And all of this is expressed as one single number. So to explain that, with your climate change impacts, there are different greenhouse gases that get released into the atmosphere. There are a number of different types of those gases, but a carbon footprint collects all of that information and gives you it as one number for your climate change impact. And that's why you might see that little acronym there, CO2e, which means carbon dioxide equivalent. You don't need to worry about that too much. It's just a way of grouping all greenhouse gases into one number. So that's what a carbon footprint is. It's a measure of all the greenhouse gases that your organization releases expressed in one number. But what is included within a carbon footprint? So just going down into a little bit more detail about what a carbon footprint includes and what it captures. So a footprint should include all of the activities that cause a climate change impact that your organization is involved with. And you should start with those activities that create the most impact as your priority. There is, fortunately enough, a framework that already exists for what should be included in carbon footprints, and this is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So here's where it gets a little bit technical, but I'm just going to keep it kind of very surface level, really. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol breaks the emissions down into what is known as scopes. There's scope 1, which is kind of in the middle of that diagram there, scope 2, which is to the left of the screen, and then scope 3, which is before and after that middle arrow. Scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions. This means that you directly create them. So that might be that you turn on your boiler, or it might be turning the keys in the car that you own. You are essentially creating the emissions there and then. They're happening on the site and as a direct result of your action. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions. And they're the emissions that you indirectly cause by purchasing them. And in general, this framework says that the scope 2 emissions are electricity, because the actual emissions are occurring elsewhere, but you're causing those emissions to occur by buying that electricity, by using that electricity. So scope 1 is direct, scope 2 is indirect, and scope 3 captures all other indirect emissions that occur throughout the supply chain. And that's why there are 2 scope 3 arrows there, because there's everything from the upstream supply chain, like goods and like distribution, goods and services, etc. And then there's everything from the downstream side of the value chain, such as where if you create products, where your products end up with waste and things like that. So that's a very simple overview. It's important to focus initially on the areas which are of most consequence to your organization. So if you just click again, please. The focus here is about what is relevant to your organization, and not spreading your focus across all of these different areas. So on the next few slides, I'm now going to walk through some of the most important areas for data for the screen industry and for film. So the first of these is energy. So I've put energy on as a priority here because it's one of the easiest activity areas to collect data for, and it's also one of the easiest areas to do something about it as well. So this is where a lot of people will start. So this covers scope 1 and scope 2. So it's your direct emissions and partly your indirect emissions through your electricity use. So what do you actually need to measure for energy? So what you're doing here is you're measuring the total energy used in your offices, in your cinemas, or any other building that you're using. So energy, of course, will include your electricity, your natural gas use for things like boilers and heating, and any other fuels that you might be using on site, like biofuels or oil or anything like that. There's also the energy that you may generate. So if you happen to have solar panels on the roof, for example, you can measure how much energy you're generating. So that's what you need to measure, and often that will be in kilowatt hours, or the relevant unit for each energy type. And then how you measure it, there are a number of different ways, and they vary in terms of their accuracy. So a good way of measuring energy is simply checking your invoices from your energy provider. And of course, this is a good thing to do anyway, particularly with energy costs. So checking your invoices is a good start. There will always be the amount of energy that you used on your invoice, and that's how you start tracking that. However, that is sometimes estimated data, that sometimes uses assumptions and averages from the energy provider. So it's better if you actually go down and read your meters, and there's a picture of a very glamorous picture of a meter there for you to read. But what's even better is to use a building management system or a smart meter. So this is a way of getting kind of automated meter reads, really, which are far more accurate. If you rent your building, you can kind of circumvent all of this just by asking your landlord. Your landlord should be able to tell you what how much energy you're using. And another important point is if you only operate in a part of your building, so this may be the case for your office use, especially if you've got shared offices, you obviously don't want to include all the energy data for the building, so you need to estimate your share of the overall building emissions. So what you would do here is ask your landlord for the total energy bills for the building, and then you work out how much space you take up on the office floor, or how many people you have within your organization compared to the overall building. And then you divide the total amount of energy used for the building against your portion of it. So it's just a way of kind of fragmenting. It's a very simple sum to work out how much you're contributing to the overall energy usage in the building. And I've just got an image there of the Everyman Cinema in Liverpool, just because it's a great example of how you can use data to start taking actions to reduce your energy emissions. So the Everyman Cinema in its rebuilding was very focused on sustainability, and they've done a number of amazing things, specifically regarding energy. The heating for the building comes from an air source heat pump that essentially works like a fridge in reverse. And hot water comes from a combined heat and power unit, which also generates electricity from waste heat. And then the 4 chimneys that you see there on the roof are actually for natural ventilation, which means less or no energy is used for air conditioning. So there's just a few things there to consider for reducing your environmental impacts from energy use. The next, oh yes, we have Keir speaking remotely, not in real time, but we have a pre-recorded video from Keir about the work that they've done at the BFI on energy use.
As part of our Screen Culture 2033 strategy, we committed to environmental sustainability in all areas of our work. So mostly you'll have heard us talk about our National Lottery funding and how we're supporting National Lottery awardees and wider industry. But we also recognise that we have to do some work on our own sites, our own estate. We have 5 sites across the UK, including the BFI National Archive, which is housed at Berkhamsted and Gaydon. We have a head office at Stephen Street near Tottenham Court Road in London, BFI South Bank here, and IMAX at Waterloo. It's a complicated estate with a number of different activities ongoing. It's really challenging to try and get a grasp of what we're doing across all of our sites and how we can be most sustainable in all areas of our operations and the physical body of our estate, the what you might call embodied carbon if we're talking in carbon terms. So we started by working out what we already do and don't do, and we didn't want to stop any initiatives that are underway already while we zoom out and take a bit of a wider view. But we were focused really on performance and progress. So what do we want to change, and how are we going to change that in a realistic and meaningful way? One of the ways that we did that on our site was that we hired an energy and carbon manager in April 2023, and in the first 6 months of their role being in post, they saved almost their entire salary in energy costs just tweaking things on site. And the way they were able to do that was mostly through heating controls, only switching on the heating when people are coming into the building, not having it running overnight. And we did that because we've got half-hourly electricity meters in most of our buildings, and we're installing them in the buildings that we don't have. For example, at Berkhamsted, where the National Archive and Conservation Centre is, we're installing them there as well, so that we get more of a picture of where we use our energy. And having a person who understands building management systems is really, really important for us to be able to tweak, really, but not do anything structural. We didn't install any insulation. We haven't put solar panels on the roofs, nothing like that. We've literally just been tweaking the timings of our operations, how we're using the building more cleverly so that we can save on our utility bills and energy costs.
I feel like I should say thank you, Keir. It's a bit weird thanking a pre-recorded message, but it felt rude not to. So moving on to another area of focus, and actually this is an area which a lot of you just in that poll just now responded that you have started measuring this. So this is business travel. So again, what to measure with business travel? Here you're measuring travel for anyone considered part of the organization. So this is about your employees going to meetings, maybe traveling abroad, doing site visits, things like that. And what you need to measure here is the transport type, which is obviously things like, you know, whether it was they took the car, whether it was a taxi, whether it was a bus, whether it was the train, very simply the transport type, and then the distance that they traveled via that transport type. This is very sort of paint by numbers, but that, you know, it's as simple as that really. You're just measuring the miles or kilometers from point A to point B. Another way of doing it though is to measure the fuel use for business purposes, and that might be relevant if you have company cars, for example, and again that travel for meetings. How to measure? So how you actually get that data? You can ask your business travel agents if you happen to have one, for the travel that they've booked. I think that's going to be particularly relevant for any international travel that you might be doing. They will be very used to receiving requests for a whole list for a year, for example, of all the staff travel that they've booked. So you have all that information already available. Although it might also be that you need to run an employee survey, very simply, and or get some travel expense data as well from your finance teams. And that, again, that can include things like fuel card allowance, fuel card expenses for any company cars you might have. And just as a very quick reminder, the graph on the right there is just probably not telling us anything that we don't know, but this is the emissions of different transport types. Obviously, domestic flying and long-haul flights are very carbon intensive. Taking the car with just one passenger is also really, really carbon intensive. Probably might surprise a few of you how high that is. Going down to the lower end of the scale of taking the train and taking the coach, which has lower emissions per kilometre travelled per passenger. So that's just to inform the kind of actions that you want to be taking, because of course we don't want to just be measuring the footprint, but we also want to be looking at what we can do to reduce the footprint from business travel. The next area of focus is about audience travel. So obviously business travel and audience travel are very similar. It's important to stress, though, that with audience travel for cinemas and festivals and such like, audience travel will be the largest part of your carbon footprint. However, it is unfortunately the hardest part to measure accurately, almost for obvious reasons, really, just because it's hard to engage your audience on audience travel. And it's also the hardest part to do anything about, because it's beyond your direct control. You can only really influence how your audience decide to travel to your cinema or to your festival. But this means it's all the more important to get that data and to understand your data and understand what is influencing your audience to travel in the way in which they are. So again, there's the same breakdown of what to measure and how to measure it. In terms of what to measure, it's exactly the same as business travel, really. You need to measure the transport type that each audience member is taking, the car, train, bus, taxi, whether they're cycling or walking. And then the distance traveled, so from their home to the cinema or to the festival, for example. It's also important to understand, this is kind of going beyond just the raw numbers of the footprint, the motivations for how they traveled. So why did they decide to travel in the way in which they did? And how you actually get that data, there are, again, a number of different ways that you can employ, different methods. Probably the most accurate is to get ticket sale information. So when you sell a ticket online, very often it will prompt a user to have an account. And the account will be linked with a home address or a postcode. And you can use that information to assume that they traveled from that postcode, which was their home address, to the known destination of your cinema or of your festival. So that's the way in which you can determine distance. And then in terms of working out the percentage split of how audience traveled, you can do an audience travel survey. Now, I'd recommend either doing an audience travel survey on the door, a very simple question, how did you travel here today? Or a post-visit survey. So you can piggyback on typical, did you enjoy your visit with us today surveys with a very simple question on how they traveled. And we found actually that if you engage your audience on why you're asking that question, why you're asking for how they traveled, and it's about understanding the environmental impact and the sustainability initiatives around it, they will very often want to help and get involved. And then another way is actually to put a QR code up pre-filming on the screen, pre-screening of the film, sorry. So you can ask your audience there and then with an online survey. So there's a few different methods that you can employ to get audience travel survey, and it's a really good idea to get information on that because it will represent the largest part of your footprint. There's also waste, and this is the last area that I'll talk about. So with waste, what to measure here, you want to understand what materials you have on site. And you can do that by taking a bit of an inventory, making a bit of a list of all the materials that are involved with the sale of your goods and services on site, all the materials that might be brought and left within the cinema or at the festival, for example. And then you can understand the amount of total waste that's generated, which will normally be in kilograms or tons. And then also you need to understand where that waste is going at the end of its life? So is it being recycled? Is it going to what's known as waste to energy or incineration? Is it going to compost or to landfill? And very simply, how you measure that is you put the pressure on your waste supplier. So you don't need to come up with the answers. You can ask your waste supplier for a breakdown of the total amount of waste they are collecting off you, and you can ask them where that waste is going. It's not always super accurate from your waste supplier. They might give you quite a generic percentage towards recycling or towards waste to energy or towards landfill. But there are conversations happening all the time with waste suppliers to improve the accuracy of that data. And you can ask them for as accurate information as they can possibly give to be able to get your waste data to input into your footprint. So once you've got your carbon footprints, that shows you what your impact is, but not exactly why your impact is like it is. So you need to do a bit of an analysis to understand the full story. It's not just case closed, done your carbon footprint, no need to think about it again. You need to understand why certain areas are larger than others, and also year on year, what initiatives and what changes are having the greatest impact on reducing your emissions. So just as some examples here, so if your energy usage was, over 5,000 tons, you might compare that to your energy usage last year, and it might have increased. And that might be, you need to do the analysis to understand why that might be. And it might be because of a change to your opening hours, which means that you've got your energy and your heating on for longer, for example. There are other areas as well that, you might decrease your total waste amounts, but your recycling rates might stay the same. So you might have done well to increase the amount of reusable items on site, but not done enough to engage audiences on increasing the amount of recycling into different bins on site. So again, there's just some analysis that you need to do. And the other examples there are, it might be that you actually don't know why there has been a change in your data. So you need to have those conversations internally and to explore that more and more. This slide is just an example here of Shambhala Festival, which is a music festival, and it's really known for its sustainability. They're very pioneering in trying lots of innovations within sustainability. But it's really interesting to note, and this is why we brought it up as an example, is that their footprint from last year actually increased quite significantly, despite it being a real shining light within the sustainability movement in the cultural landscape. And they didn't shy away from the fact that their carbon footprint had increased. They actually communicated in a way which was very transparent. And the fact was that their carbon footprint actually increased because they were measuring more areas. So this is just something to note, that the more accurate your carbon footprint becomes and the more areas you start to collate data for, it can actually look like your carbon footprint is increasing. And that's not something to shy away from, but it's something actually to recognize and understand that you're actually getting a clearer picture. So the two pie charts there, one from 2022, they basically just focused their measurement on audience travel and then a little bit on energy. And that's what's reflected in the footprint. But for the 2023 footprint, they had all those areas. They had audience travel, waste, crew travel, supplier travel, materials, food and drink, and so on. And they just were able to collect all that data. So it's not the be all and end all just to have the carbon footprint number and almost to cheat the system by not measuring too much and then saying you've got a small footprint. You need a really clear view of what your footprint is to then understand that and use that to inform your strategy. And we have another example here from the watershed. So another quick video for you.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm climate action researcher at Watershed in Bristol. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how our carbon accounting process has informed what are now our climate action priorities. So I joined Watershed in early 2021 in the middle of a pandemic. But at that point, Watershed had been reporting to Arts Council and Julie's Bicycle for several years. But what the situation was is that because the work was being done, but only by a few people. And so while we were doing the carbon accounting, that information wasn't being relayed back into the organisation, to across staff members, to inform decision making. And there's no real point to doing the carbon accounting unless it's informing decision making. So at that time, we decided to set a new baseline year. We just declared a climate emergency. And so we were like, let's do this properly. And for the first time, we will try and measure our scope 3 emissions, which we hadn't done before. So we worked with Earthly to do that first kind of initial footprint, which was going to be our baseline to reduce from. However, as this is our first foray into carbon accounting, the real process was learning about what the data that we didn't have. So it was a very incomplete picture. And it was really a process to learn, okay, who else needs to be involved in this data collection process across the organization, and how can we do this better going forward? So we decided from there to work with a carbon consultant, CLD Carbon. But from that, we took that initial baseline. And so then we, from that, took some priorities. We had about 6 or 7 priorities. The difficulty with this was that because was the first time we'd taken our scope 3 emissions, we didn't have anything to compare it to. So we ended up focusing a lot on travel, because a huge chunk of our footprint at that time was, it said it was international travel, and we were like, that's quite an easy one to reduce compared to other ones. So we were like, great, we'll focus a lot on travel, and we did. And then when we started working with a carbon consultant and we actually managed to pull together a few years of footprints, we realized, oh my God, 2018, 2019 was a kind of anomalous year, because we were doing a project called Creative Producers International. So it was really not like any other year. We were just doing an unusual amount of flying that year. So we'd done all this good work on travel, which was great, but actually once we'd done this work with Craig, our carbon accountant, we had a few years of scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 to compare. It was much easier to pull out what our key priorities should be. And now we only have 4 priorities that we're working on. Instead of spreading ourselves really thin and trying to do everything at once, we're just tackling the kind of big emitters. So for us, our four priorities are our building. The first one is our building. Around 38% of our emissions come from our heating, our energy, electricity use, and like the servers that we use. So our focus really is on figuring out a way to retrofit our building, and do this in a kind of creatively engaged way, future-proof cultural infrastructure against climate action, and kind of think about how we can build in inclusion and accessibility into how we're retrofitting our building as well, how we might contribute to kind of the ecology of Bristol city centre. But our building is a huge chunk, so it has to be kind of a key focus for us. The second one is procurement. A huge chunk of most of our footprint is procurement, almost, I think, 55%. And a huge chunk of that, the majority of that is from our food and drink in our cafe bar. And this was just really useful, even though it's really hard to bring down emissions from procurement and from buildings, actually, to be like, these are the 2 things that we need to focus on. We've done all the low-hanging fruit, and actually, as an organisation, we really need to strategize on how to reduce those. That was really important. The other 2, one of them is organisational change. We are able to do all of this stuff because we built a really strong basis of like organizational training. So we do have carbon literacy training, and also from doing this carbon accounting process, we have a really strong basis on which to build and do some of the more difficult stuff, the more difficult priorities. And we have to keep making sure that we're putting time and effort into maintaining that kind of strong basis for action. And the last one, of course, is projects, programming and collective action. So how do we use our public program to engage our audiences? So I think hopefully that explains a little bit about our process and how our carbon accounting process has informed the priorities that we've set in our climate action plan. You can see more about what we've done on the Watershed website. Thank you.
And thank you to Zoe there. It's always great to bring things to life with a real example. I'm just going to skip on actually to the tips. Yes, I'm just going to wrap this up now. So some very quick tips for carbon footprinting. First of all, don't try to measure absolutely everything. So when I shared the framework from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there's obviously lots of different areas which you could measure. But really, if you're just starting out, you need to focus on the most important areas. And they're the areas that I've just been through. So energy, business travel, audience travel, and waste are some of the areas that you can focus on to begin with, although it will depend on the nature of your organization. So you need to do that thinking as well. You should look to improve your data coverage over time. So some data points are easier to gather than others. Energy, for example, is very easy to get the data for. Other areas like audience travel, as I explained, are slightly harder, but you should look to build up the amount of data that you're covering year on year. So again, it's that similar point really, that don't try to measure everything all at once, but understand that it's a journey. The next tip is to engage the people who actually have the information. So you might be looking at this and thinking, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work for me. But you need to speak to the partners and suppliers who actually have the data. So that might be your landlord, it might be your business travel providers, it's also the audience itself, and you might have like an audience engagement person in place, and that's their specific role, or you can connect with the communications team that you might have. So it really should be a shared responsibility, not just one person's responsibility to collect all this information. And it's a good opportunity as well to engage with these people. I think, again, most often people, if they know that it's for a sustainability initiative, they are more than willing to be engaged and to get involved. And then the last point, maybe the most crucial, is that doing a carbon footprint isn't itself taking action. You need to take action to reduce your emissions in the meantime. So measurement isn't everything. Act now. Don't wait to see whether you can measure it or not. We know what reduces emissions anyway. So just get on and do the carbon footprint along the side of doing your environmental strategy. And I'll hand back with that to Amy.
Thank you, Richard. I think that was very informative and really useful for everyone. We're just going to take a 5-minute break because you've been bombarded now with a lot of information and we've been already staring at the screen for a long time. So let's reconvene in 5 minutes and we'll continue with the rest of the session. So, um, let's continue with the session. Hopefully you had a chance to maybe get away from the screen or your desk or your phone, just breathe a little bit. So we have about half an hour left, and there's plenty of other things that we wanted to show on today, but we might just kind of skip through some of these slides, but don't worry, because you will have time, you will have access to the slides after the session. So please do take the time to go through some of the things here or revise any of the stuff that we've already kind of presented on your own time. So we don't want to stress you about that. So for this next bit, I wanted to just touch on some other things when it comes, or to consider when it comes to our performance and our progress and tracking and talking about that. That goes a bit beyond carbon, because sometimes this is something that we also alluded in our climate literacy webinar. There's a bit of an obsession around carbon, and we might get what is called like carbon tunnel vision a little bit. So it's always a good reminder to understand that, our carbon footprint, as Richard already kind of said, it doesn't tell the whole story. It is a very useful tool, definitely, but there is more to it. And the carbon footprint itself is not a measure of other impacts, such as air pollution, chemical pollution, habitat destruction, or effects on nature, resource depletion, etc., that you can see kind of illustrated in this image, and that also includes social and environmental impacts that happen or that occur in the supply chain. And a carbon footprint, it doesn't also tell the story of other kinds of positive change that are happening or might be happening within your organization, such as ethical sponsorship, or the engagement that you're doing through your work and your programming, or any behavioral changes that you're seeing from either from your teams or your audiences as a result of your activities. So when we report about our environmental action, performance, and progress, or we want to communicate about that, we would really want to be offering the whole story of what we're doing, whether that includes a carbon footprint or not. So that's something just for you to consider. And also think for you to consider as well when you engage with suppliers or partners as well, if you're interested to see what others are doing, and if maybe, if you're talking to suppliers or partners, whether those are aligned to your own kind of commitments and visions and beliefs in that sense. So if they only offer like a carbon footprint with nothing else, then it's difficult for you to understand what they're really doing. So, it goes also both ways in that sense. So I wanted just to share an example to illustrate that a little bit, as something to remember, as I said, when we're reporting our progress or telling just about the things that we do. So definitely numbers can offer a good picture or a good like snapshot of our environmental impacts in a different number of areas. So this is an example of the Arts Council of England that we've been working with for a number of years, and in delivering their environmental program, which we work with national portfolio organizations. And as part of the program, the NPOs are required to report annually on their environmental impacts. And from all these different data that we kind of collate in our creative climate tools, we produce an annual report. So we have these kind of key statistics that, as you can see in the screen, and it gives, as I said, like a good snapshot of the impact of cultural organizations. But whilst, the numbers, the figures are like vital and important as well in terms of providing benchmarks and for monitoring processes, and for monitoring purposes, sorry. It's also important, understanding the dynamics of the behavioral changes and any tangible actions that are happening behind all of this. So in our tools, as beyond, the numbers and the more numerical data that NPOs are required to input, we also include this what we call a beyond carbon survey. And with this survey, the NPOs, they can kind of present qualitative details and stories of their sustainability accomplishments. So it also kind of help us pull out trends across the data about, the benefits and the value of taking this environmental action. So if you are to be using our creative climate tools, this can also kind of steer you into the kind of information that would be good for you to report when you talk about the things that you're doing. So you can maybe see, well, hopefully you can read, if not, definitely, this is published in the ACES website and on our website. So if you want to have a look at the report, there's just some examples of areas that we consider in this beyond carbon questionnaire would include, how are you incorporating sustainability as part of the wider strategy? If you're including any environmental responsibilities in your job roles, or what practices that are you undertaking in your operations or day to day, and if you have program or curated work exploring these environmental and climate themes, and if you are collaborating with other organizations on environmental solutions, etc., etc. So definitely, take the time if you want to have a look at that. And initially, at the beginning, I also mentioned as part of building our understanding and looking a bit beyond the numbers, there's the whole area that it's important to explore in terms of finding out what people think. So in this sense, that can better inform your strategy and align it with what matters to others or ensure effective action. Richard also mentioned when he was talking about the audience travel, knowing finding out what motivates people to use certain types of travel. So these are like the insights that we want to get when speaking to people. So we encourage you to definitely engage with your stakeholders to understand their attitudes, their motivations, their behaviors and perceptions around environmental action. And this is something that you might do initially as part of, maybe developing your strategy and your action plan. So you might do like a consultation with your staff. So with a lot of the organizations that we worked in supporting them for the strategy, we tend to do like a service staff or like more in-depth interviews, workshops. The same with the audience, as I'm sure a lot of you do already, some sort of audience service, for instance, or after the programs, that's where you can use this kind of different channels to also collect their insights or the views on certain things. And the same as suppliers. So obviously this is all going to depend on the size of your organization. Sometimes it doesn't need for things to be as formalized. It's literally, have those conversations with the relevant people that are part of the organization. And do not just engage, in the, let's say, beginning of the process, or if it's just to kind of develop your strategy or action plan, but also, engage with them as you're implementing changes and definitely get their feedback, to see what's working, what's not, and other areas that you might be missing or where you can kind of improve in that sense. So with the Arts Council of England, I also invite you to read this report that they produced, they published a couple of years ago now, that is titled like From Understanding to Action, because in this case, it's an organization that is documenting their own process of understanding to action. So it's for you if you want to dive in a bit more. But in this case, what they wanted is to, even though they have been reporting for a while and they already had some sort of environmental commitments, they wanted to establish like new ones and an action plan. So they decided to have or undertake like a whole internal review to understand their starting point. And even though they did like dive more into the data and environmental numbers and all of that they had, they also came up with a whole strategy or like sense of mapping out who are we going to talk to and how we're going to do that. And they did like a quite big consultation in that sense, which then helped them identify those priorities and focus areas in the future. So we'll leave also the link to this report if you wanted to also have a look into that. And another thing to kind of build your understanding is also drawing upon any insights that are out there, specifically from the industry, because that can give you, you know, a steer into what might be relevant for the audiences, and then make you think, or hints as to the things that you could be doing that could be more relevant. So this one, Richard shared, I think, at the beginning as well, just some of the results of the latest Green report from Indigo. And they also did a couple of months ago a webinar with going through with specific insights from the cinema sector. So you have the link there as well, should it be of interest. But yeah, just to draw on like any insights that come from the industry in that sense, understanding the expectations of the audiences, and then definitely, you know, gaining the insights from your specific audiences. What are the things that they could be interested in? And especially as you see in some of the results from this latest report, audiences want to help, want to support, but they need more information as to how to do that. So that's something for you to take in terms of thinking, like, how can we convey this to our audiences, and how can we help them feel that they can participate? And and just quickly, the other bit is as well in terms of reporting and communicating and capturing the work that we do through our programming. So in this case, when it comes to audiences, is how do we report and we capture our reach and impact? So this can be done in different numbers of ways, and you probably already do that in terms of surveys, or you know, having a control of how many people are attending our activities or our festivals or our workshops, depending on what you do. But going beyond, as I said, the number again is important that we capture, for instance, how people have been influenced, what have they taken from these sessions, how have their perceptions or behaviors changed with, you know, these screenings or these festivals or this kind of access to environmental and climate themed programs. So that can also steer you into thinking, how can we maybe program additional conversations and reflections around these screenings that can allow us to also capture that kind of information, and definitely talk about it and share that with others, what's been the outcome of all these different activities that you're doing, because I think people are really interested in that. And we had a quick poll, just to have a sense of if you have engaged with your staff or with your audiences, to better understand their environmental attitudes, behaviors, and perceptions. So it's a single choice. Yes, no. Definitely feel free to share in this chat if there's anything particular or anything that we can also read about, that could be interesting. So I see there's more or less a split, 50, almost 50-50. So yeah, that's interesting. But for those that haven't, I encourage you to do that. Definitely. It can be a really important source of information and insight that to inform your actions going forward. And I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm gonna just gonna mention that we have here some tips that speak more into, you know, general recommendations to apply to your environmental or sustainability communications. So things to do, things not to do. And obviously the greenwashing is a broad theme whenever we talk about communicating sustainability. But I'll leave you to just go through on your own time. But this could be for you to consider whether you're sharing your action or policy, whether you're reporting your performance or you're engaging with your audiences, or even if you're reporting what you do in an application process, for instance, for funding. Another thing that I would say is, like, be specific with the things that you do. Don't be generic about, you know, we're looking into this or that, even if it's just a planning, even if it's just in a planning stage, but be very specific with what are the things that you're focusing on and what you're planning to do. And I'll pass it on to Danielle, who is just going to talk us through our creative climate tools and just some of the utilities of using that.
Thanks, Annie. Hi, everyone. My name's Danielle Pipe. I My pronouns are she, her, and I work in the Creative Green team at Julie's Bicycle, and I'm the program coordinator for our work with the BFI on the Sustainable Screen program. So I'm just going to run through a brief overview of our creative climate tools and sort of introduce you if you are not aware of what they are. So at Julie's Bicycle, we have developed a free set of carbon calculator tools, which are developed specifically for the creative industries. So through this, you can look at tracking and understanding the impacts of your activity through any buildings that you have or you rent. So this might be an office space, or this might also be a venue or a cultural building or a cinema or an archive space. And you can also look at reporting for a tour, event, festival, or a training course. So within this, there are many different impact areas that you can report on. So the obvious ones: energy use, water consumption and waste, and also business travel, freight travel, and audience travel and materials. And these tools, as we've already mentioned previously, can help you to prioritize and inform your action and track progress over time. So they clearly show your impacts and your carbon footprint year on year, and you can easily see that. And I'm going to show you that now. So this is a bit of an overview of the interface of the Creative Climate tools and what it looks like when you get onto the site. As I mentioned, these are freely available, and you can just sign up for an account, and I'll post the link in the chat in a minute if you haven't used them before. So year on year, you can create many different footprints, as I mentioned, for buildings or projects, and it will show you your results here in a really clear graph, highlighting all of the different impact areas and the associated emissions with each area. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so, for example, if you were to choose a venue or a cultural building like this footprint example highlights, it will take you onto the footprint page, and at the top there are multiple tabs for all the different impact areas where you can input your data. So this is the page on energy use, and there are lots of different options for all of the different potential energy that you might be using. On the right-hand side, there will be a tally, which will show you the data that you've input and the energy total as it rises for each individual area that you put into the tools. And you can see that it shows you a running total as you go through. So it's really user-friendly and really in-depth, and it will clearly show you all of your impact data. So here's a bit of an overview of what you can do with the tools. So there are building footprints. As I mentioned, you can choose this for an office or a venue or a cultural building. The main difference between these are that venues will include audience travel. So this might be for a cinema venue or an archive space. You might want to include audience travel. And then you have office with basic impact areas and including freight travel if that's necessary. And then you can also input a project footprint. So if you're doing a training course, you might want to include an indoor event footprint. For a festival, you can look at indoor, outdoor event footprints, and then also tours. And then we also have a newly developed custom footprint tool. So this just allows you to personalize the footprint tool and the different impact areas that you want to include, so you can make it more specific to your activities and your work. And as Ami's mentioned briefly, we do have some additional features on the tools which move a bit beyond the quantitative number of a carbon footprint and look at a more holistic approach to your different impact areas. So this will look at the Beyond Carbon survey. So this is a questionnaire which covers lots of different areas, and it can also serve as a source of ideas for areas that your organization might not have already thought about, you might not have looked at yet. So it looks at areas such as your environmental policy, investment, and how ethical this is in your banking and your pensions, any roles and responsibilities related to climate action, governance, and additional info on energy, waste, and water. procurement decisions, food, whether you're serving vegetarian food, for example, and staff and audience travel policies. So this shows you a bit of the Beyond Carbon survey and some of the questions. Now, this isn't monitored for anything. This is just for your own personal information. You can use it as a checklist to help you support the actions that you're taking, and you also might get some more ideas from it and things you haven't thought about. So you can see two of the areas here around policy and how central environmental principles are to your business strategies and plans. And then on the investment one, it looks at things like how your pension providers and banks are investing your money. So it just gives you that more holistic view and a bit more detail beyond the carbon footprint number. And I just want to highlight here 4 specific BFI National Lottery awardees that, as part of the Sustainable Screen Programme, you should already know about this, that you're going to be asked to report on the Julie's Bicycle Creative Climate Tools. And on the 27th of February, we're delivering a webinar specifically for BFI awardees, looking at the reporting requirements and how you should report on our tools depending on your specific activity. And our digital team are going to do a full demonstration of the Creative Climate Tools, specifically in relation to screen industries.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. So we have about 10 minutes left that we would hope to leave for Q&A. So definitely fire those questions if there's anything that you want us to clarify. In the meantime, I'm just gonna show you some of the additional things that we've added to the presentation that we won't have time to go through. But in the meantime, as the questions come along, I'll just share or show you what we have. So again, we have some other recordings and videos in the presentation, so we invite you to just have a look at them when you have time. But we recognize as well that, collaboration, knowledge sharing, and wider support is all play into helping you build understanding, and sessions like today's, where we've seen even in the chat, some of you have been sharing some of the things. So this is also helpful for organizations of all kinds and size to kind of build upon that understanding. So we had some examples.
And what I would also say is find out what others are working on.
Sorry, dear, I didn't mean to play you. So just an example that we have here that we've included is the Yorkshire Film Archive, and just as to how they've taken some steps to understand better how they can manage their environmental impacts and the action that they can take, and how they explain on their own on the website, that there's a link there as well, just to how they collaborated with university students, that those were the ones that kind of brought into the time and resource to help them, assess what are they doing currently, and then research on what are the potential changes and development of the action plan. So again, just as an example of collaboration, which could be a helpful way for you to figure out what to do and what to focus on. And then obviously just highlighting all the things and support available in the sector. So maybe some of you are part of the BFI Film Audience Network or are aware of it. So they have launched this Green Exhibitors Mentoring Program that for which applications are not open. So definitely have a look into that if this is something that you would like to explore. And there's also here a video of Manon, which is the head of the film hubs, just explaining an overview of what the members are focusing on. And
hello, my name is Manon, and I'm the
sorry. And other tools and resources available. So, for example, Watershed, which put together this creative climate action tool, which is designed for smaller businesses as well, or organizations, collectives, even freelancers. So there's definitely a bunch of things out there. We mentioned in the previous webinar that as part of our work with the BFI, we're putting together a resource hub, which with the aim of collating these different resources are across, that span across the sector and that might be relevant. So hopefully that's going to be useful for you as well into just developing your understanding and thinking about what you can do. And there's other actors or like small players as well that are doing plenty of good work. So one of them is Master Studio, which it's Mandy Keane is a co-founder and CEO, just explaining the kind of work that they do or they have been doing, especially with small independent cinemas, in supporting them in a variety of areas, including developing strategies and measuring carbon footprints. And
Thank you to Julie's Bicycle.
Sorry. And one example is with the work that they did very recently with the Living Room Cinema in Liphook, for which you can read more about it there. So I'm just gonna check here in the chat. I think someone has been sharing some good things. Richard, are you still around? Yeah.
Yes, I am.
There's a question in the Q&A section from Mal O'Hara. So it speaks to if we're starting with limited activity or baseline, do you suggest starting with scope 1 and 2 first?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mal. I think that's a sensible approach, and I think that's what a lot of people begin with, because those two aspects mainly focus on your energy data and the business travel if you own company cars. So it's information that you can get quite easily. What I would say though is maybe start with scope 1 and 2 for actually collecting the data, but at the same time make a plan for how you'll get that scope 3 data. It's also worth saying, maybe in response to that, that you can use expenditure. So basically your financial cost for a lot of scope 3 categories, which is a good estimate. So within the carbon calculator that we've got, you can put in how much you've spent for certain areas, and that will give you an estimation. So in some ways that can also be quite a good first step into getting scope 3 information. But absolutely focus on scope 1 and 2 and make a plan for scope 3 if you're just starting out. I think that's probably a very sensible approach.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Hopefully that answers to your question, Mal. Great, thank you, Lisa. Another point I was gonna make that actually Kier mentions in one of his latest videos is that well, we saw in the poll at the beginning of how many of you communicate or report or have shared any of the reporting or calculations that you've done with your carbon footprint or environmental measures, but then this also extends to other kinds of information regarding with the activities that you're doing. So just to reinforce on that do share the things that you're doing, even if you're just starting, and even if it's just in planning mode. Kier says in his video, the BFI is open for you to go to them and have a chat and share what you're doing. We would also like to know about the things that you're planning to do or that are already out there. Because as part of the resource hub, we're also putting together, case studies, examples from the screen sector, just to kind of build on this knowledge sharing network. So definitely chat with us, come to us, let us know if about the things that you're doing, and just not us, everyone else, I think, would be very interested and would benefit from learning what are you doing. So do talk about the things, make noise, be loud.
I think just to add on that point as well, that it doesn't have to be perfect. Like you can start sharing things you're trying, especially if you're at the very beginning, because there are going to be other organizations and people who are starting to implement things, and not everything is going to work for you and your organization, but it's good to communicate this to others that you're trying and this worked and this didn't, and there's also nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And being very honest, I would say, with the things that worked and what didn't work, then maybe if you have very specific targets or objectives for a year and then, that didn't happen, that's okay. It's just be very transparent about, well, that didn't happen and maybe why. And, it just gives a more realistic view and picture of how it is out there. So I'm just looking at the chat. People keep sharing resources, so thank you, Sam. Yes, definitely have a look into. I'm seeing a lot of different links in the chat, so definitely have a look. You have a chance now before we finish.
We've had a question, Amy, from Brent Woods. When using the climate tools, would you select multiple areas to measure, for example, 2 office locations and 4 outdoor events? And does this give an individual as well as combined impact?
That's probably best for you, Danielle, on the tools. Answer your own question.
Yeah, let me reread this. Yes, so on the tools, you can separate different office locations. So you can have multiple office footprints if you have multiple office locations, and you can have multiple project footprints if you have multiple outdoor events. And this will all link into your combined impact for the year. And you will see the individual impact of the different areas. So yes, you can select multiple areas to measure.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Brent, for your question. So we've reached the end of our session. Please do answer the survey if you have a minute, just when we finalize or when the window closes. And yeah, again, thank you to Richard, thank you to Danielle, thank you for everyone for attending, for being so engaged, for everything that you're sharing in the chat. We might be able to retrieve that and maybe share it back once the recording and the slides are made available. And for now, this is this has been the last one of our series of webinars, but we continue our work with the BFI for, the next couple of years. So there's gonna be more coming up from us. And yeah, stay tuned to our resource hub as well for that coming live in the next couple of months too. But yeah, thank you so much for joining and hope you have a good afternoon as well. Yeah.